Hey guys, Nathan here, Absurd Being, and we're looking at the last video today for Kierkegaard. So we'll be looking at that diagram down the bottom there, focusing on repetition, recollection, and remembering. And this will see us out, at least for all of the things that I've flagged as kind of important or central to Kierkegaard's thought. So yeah, let's get into it. The first pair we'll look at today is recollection and remembering. All right, so memory. So what does Kierkegaard think about memory? Well, it's very sterile. It's just a recounting of details. So very factual kind of. There's no memory doesn't kind of carry us onward anywhere. It's just all we're doing is remembering details from the past, and usually the more detailed the better. So it's also immediate, Kierkegaard says. So that, again, the idea that there's no depth, there's no kind of it's not doing anything. It's just taking what's already happened, something you've already experienced, and just remembering it. But that's all that happens. Nothing more takes place. And then when I say that, it might sound a little bit strange, but in comparison with recollection, we'll see that there's a significant difference. So with recollection, this is as opposed to memory, which is immediate in scope. The recollection is concerned with the eternal. So the point there is that only the essential can be recollected. So only essences, ideas. We're dealing with these kind of universals now, not just the facts of what happened. So only the essential can be recollected. Like I said, concerned with the idea, not particular details. So not specifics of what happened, but we're identifying essences, universal ideas. And that means that recollection is reflective in nature. And an example that Kierkegaard gives is homesickness. So the idea with homesickness is that it's evoking a mood. And mood is important in recollection. And what it means is that recollection is the condition for all productivity. If a person no longer wishes to be productive, he needs merely to remember the same thing that recollecting he wanted to produce, and production is rendered impossible. So this quote really gets to the core of what Kierkegaard's on about here with recollection. It's productive. Recollection stirs us forward. It kind of inspires action in us, moves us forward. And as opposed to memory, which like I said, it's just immediate. It doesn't do anything. It's just a recollection. It's not a good word. It's just a regurgitation of facts. There's no, they don't kind of impel any action in the person remembering them. So another quote: the ideal would be to be able to feel homesickness even though one is at home, or to let the illusion work on oneself with the full force of illusion even though one is fully aware. So that's another important point about recollection. It involves illusion. So it's not just, it's not remembering something that happened in the past. It has a goal. You're right. The goal of recollection is to, like I say, inspire action. It's to move you forward. It's to allow you to be productive, to project. That's Heidegger, but to project forward into the future. So it's an inspiration to action, and that's why Kierkegaard calls recollection reflection to the second power. So it's reflection in the sense that we're talking about essences, the ideas. So we're reflecting, but it's not this abstract reflection of philosophy, or what Kierkegaard saw as philosophy. It's reflection to the second power. It has some, there's kind of a concrete element to it, or it's tending towards something concrete. And just a couple of other things to note about this one. It requires knowledge about, and Kierkegaard talks a lot about this, it requires knowledge about contrasting moods, situations, and surroundings. So the idea is recollection's all about manipulating situations, manipulating them so that you can derive this benefit, derive this kind of drive to action. And that's what he's talking about with homesickness. Homesickness inspires you to do something about it. You're either going to go back home, or you're going to make the best of the situation that you're in now. But there's something that it kind of, I mean, I guess you could see it the other way too. Homesickness kind of incapacitates you in a way. You feel down, you feel depressed. But I think Kierkegaard's looking at it from the other side of the coin, where it's a mood that if you approach it the right way, can lift you into action. It can make you do something. And the ideal would be to be homesick even though you're at home. So again, this idea of illusion, that it's about creating a situation in which something can happen, in which you can perform something, or do something, or complete something that you want to complete. And so there's this element of manipulation involved, because you have to create the situation in order for recollection to work. Strangely, he says that also recollection is created through contrast. So if you wanted to recollect a banquet, you would need a quiet place. Just throw that in. And a couple of other smaller points about this. He says the young have a quick memory but no recollection. Old people, however, lose their memory, but they have the poetic far-sightedness of recollection. So recollection is something that comes with age, or wisdom, I guess we could say. Something after you've experienced enough, I guess, to have things to recollect, that can, to have that kind of pool of resources to draw on to create recollection. He says regarding this, that memory overwhelms the soul with details, and this distracts recollection. So again, kind of not so fond on memory. And recollection is also done by, obviously, well, not obviously, but of course for Kierkegaard, by the individual. So recollection is an individual endeavor, as opposed to memory, which he says is for groups. So including, he gives some examples: birthdays, banquets, that type of thing, where you're celebrating something, you know, an event, or an anniversary or something like that. That's a type of memory, and it's done in a group, as opposed to recollection, which is all about the self, the individual. Okay, so that's recollection and remembering, and let's move into the last part of this shorter video, which is the pair repetition and recollection. Okay, so repetition. What is repetition? Well, we've talked about recollection. What's this repetition? Repetition, the quote is, it's a deepening in the one thought. And so the opposite here, then, maybe this is a good way to get at it. The opposite is the person who never repeats him or herself, but finishes everything exceptionally quickly before moving on to new things. So there's this idea of not having really exhausted a subject, not having really immersed yourself in it and gotten to the details, gotten to the core of what it is you're thinking about or reflecting on or studying, but you've gleaned a superficial knowledge, and then you're on to the next thing, and you'll do the same there. You'll get a superficial taste, onto the next. So kind of like a jack of all trades. And I definitely, that's one of the reasons why I make these videos, and one of the reasons I make them as long as they are. They're long, they're in depth, they're really into the fine-grained details, because it's like my kind of protest against the whole kind of the modern idea of Sartre in 10 minutes or something like that. You can't get an idea. You can't understand Sartre in 10 minutes. You can get like some concepts. You can and have a very superficial understanding, but there's no depth there. And so that's the reason that I make these videos, and the reason that they're so long and boring is precisely because of what Kierkegaard's talking about here. I want not to just touch on this, touch on that, and be very superficial and very broad, but very superficial. I would rather hammer out one topic or one book or one philosopher for however long it's taken me to get through this series, which is about 6 months, right? So so this is my personal repetition, I guess. Another quote. Let me give you another quote. Sometimes to be finished too quickly is the most dangerous thing of all. When time itself is the task, it will be a mistake to finish before time. So that's a good quote, and that drives to the core of the idea of repetition, which is the fact that what Kierkegaard is ultimately wanting us to repeat is subjectivity, our lives, our inwardness. He wants us to focus on that, and that should be the only focus, or the central focus at least. And we talked about this in the last video, that's what he sees as lacking amongst his contemporaries. And we could definitely say the same thing today, I think. It's all about sound bites. It's all about, people don't have the attention span to sit down for an hour or 2 hours and do something. It's like 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. There's just no sense of sticking with the one thing. But as Kierkegaard says, when time itself is the task, when your life is the task, finishing too quickly is a mistake, or finishing quickly is a mistake, which is, but that's what tends to get praised these days, is finishing things quickly, doing it fast, instead of doing it thoroughly or in depth. So that's what Kierkegaard's getting at there. It's about our lives. And I think I've said the same thing here. This is the situation we're in with subjectivity, because life is the task here. And I've got another quote. For you to be finished with life before life is finished with you is precisely not to have finished the task. So again, it's just repetition. It's about our lives. So that's from the postscript. We can see the same thing in Fear and Trembling, in the epilogue of that book, where Kierkegaard talks about, there's a little story there about children who finish playing all of their games by lunch and then move on to make new games, or want to make new games afterwards. Are they more advanced or developed than other children, he asks. That's the question. Who could make the games they already know last the whole day? Sorry. Are they more... Man, totally screwed that up. Let's rewind. Are they more advanced or developed than other children who could make the games they already know last the whole day? Or does it not rather show that those children lack the good-natured seriousness that belongs to play? So, that it's just a nice quote, just reinforcing everything I've said, I think. So let's turn and just have a quick look at how repetition connects with recollection. And I'll give you a quote. This is from the book called Repetition. Repetition and recollection are the same movement, just in opposite directions, because what is recollected has already been and is thus repeated backwards, whereas genuine repetition is recollected forwards. So this is kind of nice, actually. It's kind of an interesting way to approach this. So recollection and repetition are the same idea, just kind of in opposite directions. Recollection, we're dealing with something that's already been, something that's happened in the past, and so it's repeated. When we recollect, we're repeating that what has already taken place in the past. So it's kind of like looking backwards. We're repeating something. Whereas genuine repetition is recollected forwards. And I think the way to understand this is, so repetition's about looking to understand something, coming to a deeper grasp of something, focusing on the same thing again and again and again, not just moving on to different topics. And so in a way, recollection is something it's recollecting forwards. It's tough to square those two, because recollection is the way we use it, it's always about the past. But if you think about it as something that's like collecting again, recollecting, we're recollecting what we already know about the topic, but with a view to moving forwards this time. So that it's just kind of a difference in emphasis, I guess, a shift in emphasis on the two. So that's quite cool. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. I'll give you a couple of examples of repetition that come up in the book Repetition. The first one is Kierkegaard talks about a professor pounding his fist on the table and explaining something, or so explaining something once and then explaining again, this time pounding his fist on the table. And the idea they're saying the same thing but producing a different effect in his listeners, in his audience. So there's repetition, but it has the goal of furthering or deepening something, deepening understanding, or bringing about a new approach, or a nuance that maybe you hadn't thought of the first time around. Another example in that book is the way that Job, the Job story from the Bible, the way that Job, he goes through all those hardships, but eventually he gets more back from God after his trial. So he gets everything back. There's this idea of repetition. He gets everything back plus more. So there's that extra, there's that added depth that comes with repetition. And one more example too, the same idea. In the story, in Repetition, there's a young man who gets repetition at the end of the story when his ex-girlfriend gets married, or his ex-fiancée, I think, gets married, and he gets everything back. He is able to return to his life. He's able to move on. So he gets his life restored. That's the repetition. But he now has a deeper appreciation and a deeper understanding of life and relationships and himself. And so there's that's the extra that makes repetition what it is, that makes repetition so valuable. So repetition is a characteristic of inwardness, which is pretty clear. And he also contrasts repetition with habit. Sorry, this is Kierkegaard, not the young man. Although Kierkegaard was a young man. Anyway, it's contrasted with habit because habit arises, he says, when the eternal drops out of the repetition. So habit is just, if you're doing the same thing again and again out of habit, that's not repetition. Repetition has this extra drive, and it gets you something more than the last time you did it. whereas a habit is exactly doing the same thing again and again. So he draws a distinction between those two. So I just want to move on to the last look at either or, and my last 2 points regarding repetition. So in either or, Kierkegaard talks about love first in terms of repetition. And first love, your first love, he says, is locked in time. It only happens once. You can't have a second first love. So repetition is impossible with first love. On the other hand, marriage is historical and works itself out in time. And so that allows repetition. So that's kind of nice. That's an interesting take on it as well, which kind of makes sense too, right? If something only happens once, then it's fixed. You can't, you're unable to take it and kind of revisit, keep working with it. You're unable to, it's not available for repetition. As opposed to marriage, for example, where there's kind of depth gained over a period of time. If the marriage works well, your whole life, I guess. So repetition is possible, and I guess the repetition that we're talking about there is it's the things that you do in your relationship every day or every week. That it can take on a bit of boredom. There can be tedium associated with it, but if you approach it in the right way, there's a deepening of the relationship at the same time, and that's only possible because marriage, by definition, is not one moment. It's an entire. It's a deeper commitment over a longer period of time. Like I say, ideally, well, if everything works well, your whole life. So I like that idea there, and that ties in with the three spheres too, right? The 3 spheres of existence. So the aesthetic is very immediate. It's characterized by immediacy, and that there's no repetition available there because it only, whatever it is, only happens once. You live for the moment. Whereas if you move into the ethical or the religious, there's you gain this element of historical. You gain this element of history to whatever it is you do. So repetition becomes available there. Finally, he talks about art. I'll mention it. I'm not, I don't know, I don't really have a great opinion either way as far as this is concerned, but Kierkegaard talks about it a lot in either or, so I'll throw it out there. He says the more historical and concrete the idea and the more concrete the medium, and the most concrete medium for Kierkegaard is language, then the more repeatable it is, whatever it is, the artwork is. So he says every generation will have its Faust, as opposed to the more sensual and abstract the idea, and the more abstract the medium, and the most abstract medium is music, the less repeatable it is. And so Kierkegaard says there will only be one Don Giovanni. Like I say, I don't really have much of an opinion on that aesthetics, but I like this idea of repetition and recollection, and the distinction between recollection and remembering. And it's interesting too that Heidegger, we can see repetition play out in Heidegger, right? I mean, everything revolves around being. That's it. There's only one question for him, and he says that, he's only concerned with one thing, being. And so I think that's a nice, tangible example of what Kierkegaard's talking about here with repetition. Anyway, let's move to a summary. So we saw first there that remembering is immediate, and it's basically just a recounting of details, very factual, objective. Recollection, on the other hand, concerned with the essential, concerned with the idea. And it's critical here to evoke a mood which kind of provokes action, provokes activity, gets you doing something. And it's necessary then, like I said, for productivity. Key part of this, as with all of Kierkegaard's thought, is recollection is for the individual. And he also calls it, which is quite nice, a backwards repetition, or a repetition backwards. And then repetition, the last part, basically this is a deepening in the one thought. And he nicely calls this a forwards recollection, which we talked about. And finally, only the historical or the concrete can be repeated. Okay, and so that's it. We're done with Kierkegaard. So if you've stuck with me through all of these videos, hopefully that's helped. All of this, well, the diagram's available on my website, and there's all of my summaries of the books that I've read, all the Kierkegaard books that I've read. They're all online as well. I don't have copies of my notes that I read from, basically because they're not particularly useful. I think they're pretty scratchy, and I don't use them. It's not a script, so I don't bother posting these anywhere. But yeah, hopefully you've gotten something from all these videos. I'll stop rambling now, and the next video series though will be Maurice Merleau-Ponty, this bad boy, Phenomenology of Perception. Don't get me started on this now. I'm not going to talk about it yet. I'll save it for the next video, but very much looking forward to this. So thank you again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next series.